My wife's garden was my last connection to her. I caught my daughter-in-law uprooting it for a patio extension. She looked me in the eye and said, "This isn't a graveyard anymore." My son told me, "It's her turn now." I locked myself in the shed and cried. What they didn't know was that the property deed still listed me as. I used to measure time by the way things grew. Not by clocks, not by calendars, but by the slow, patient rhythm of life pushing through soil. Every morning, just after sunrise, I would step out into the backyard with a cup of black coffee in one hand and a quiet sense of purpose in the other. The air always felt different back there, cooler, somehow softer, like the world itself knew to lower its voice out of respect. That garden wasn't just a garden. It was her. Margaret had built it from nothing. When we first moved into the house 32 years ago, the backyard was nothing but dry, stubborn dirt, clay-heavy, unforgiving, the kind of soil most people would look at once and give up on. But Margaret never gave up on anything she believed could grow. "I don't need perfect soil," she told me once, kneeling in the dirt with a trowel in hand, her hair tied back with that faded blue ribbon she always wore. "I just need time." And she meant it. Over the years, she turned that lifeless patch into something extraordinary. Roses along the fence line, deep red, soft pink, even a rare golden variety she was ridiculously proud of. Lavender bushes that swayed gently whenever the wind passed through. A small stone path that curved through the center, leading to a wooden bench I built for her on our 10th anniversary. She used to sit there in the afternoons, a book in her lap, sunlight filtering through the leaves above her. Sometimes she'd read, sometimes she'd just sit quietly, watching the way shadows moved across the ground. I never interrupted those moments. They felt sacred. When she got sick, the garden became something else entirely. It wasn't just a place of beauty anymore, it became a place of fighting. Even when the treatments made her weak, even when walking from the house to the garden left her breathless, she insisted on going out there. I would try to help her, offer to take over the work, but she'd just smile at me and shake her head. "You can water," she'd say, "but don't you dare touch my roses." So I watered. Every morning, every evening, carefully the way she showed me, not too much, not too little, always at the roots, never the petals. And slowly, as the months passed, I began to understand something I hadn't before. The garden wasn't just something she created. It was something she trusted me with. The last time she went outside, she didn't make it to the bench. She stopped halfway down the stone path, her hand tightening around mine. For a moment, I thought she was in pain, but when I looked at her, she was smiling. "Look," she whispered. I followed her gaze. The golden roses had bloomed. Perfectly, brighter than I had ever seen them. "They waited," she said, almost to herself. That was the last full sentence she ever spoke. After she was gone, people kept telling me to move on. "Sell the house," my son Daniel suggested more than once. "It's too big for you anyway." But they didn't understand. That house wasn't just walls and a roof. It held her laughter in the kitchen, the sound of her footsteps on the stairs, the quiet hum of her voice when she thought no one was listening. And the garden. The garden was where she still lived. So I stayed. I kept everything the way she left it. Every morning I stepped outside with my coffee. I checked the soil, trimmed where needed, pulled weeds carefully, making sure not to disturb anything she had planted. I even talked to her sometimes. Not out loud, not like some grieving fool speaking into the air. Just quietly in my head. Like she could still hear me. Daniel didn't visit much in those first few years. He had his own life, a job in the city, a wife, Claire, who I had only met a handful of times before Margaret passed, polite but distant, the kind of person who always seemed to be measuring something, even in casual conversation. Still, I never pushed. People drift, it happens. But then about a year ago, things changed. Daniel called me out of the blue. "Dad," he said, his voice carrying that careful tone people use when they've already made a decision, "Claire and I have been thinking, maybe we should move in with you, help out, make things easier." I remember standing in the kitchen, staring out at the garden through the window. Help out. It sounded reasonable. It sounded kind. And if I was being honest with myself, the house had started to feel a little too quiet. So I said yes. At first, it was almost nice. The house had life in it again. Footsteps, conversations, the occasional laughter drifting down the hallway. Clea took an interest in modernizing things, new curtains, rearranged furniture, small changes that I didn't particularly care for but tolerated. "It's just updating," she said once, smiling like it was harmless. I let it go. Because the garden was untouched. Untouched and safe. Or at least I thought it was. Looking back now, I realized there were signs. Little things. The way Clea would stand at the back window, staring out at the garden with a slight crease in her brow. The way she once asked, casually, "Don't you think it's a bit overgrown?" The way Daniel avoided the topic entirely whenever it came up. I should have paid more attention. I should have understood that when people start calling something old, they're already planning to replace it. But I didn't, because some part of me believed that certain things were untouchable. That some spaces were sacred enough to be left alone. I was wrong. And the day I realized just how wrong I was the day I stopped measuring time by how things grew. And started measuring it by how things were taken away. The sound woke me before the sun did. A sharp, splintering crack, out of place, aggressive. It didn't belong to the quiet rhythm of the house, and it definitely didn't belong to the garden. For a moment, I lay still in bed, listening. Another crack. Then a dull thud. I sat up. At first I told myself it was nothing. Maybe Daniel was moving something outside. Maybe a branch had fallen. Maybe. But then came the sound that cut through every excuse I tried to make. Metal against stone. Rhythmic. Deliberate. Wrong. I was out of bed before I fully understood why. I didn't even bother with slippers. The wooden floor was cold under my feet as I moved down the hallway, past the living room toward the back door. Each step felt heavier than the last, like something inside me already knew what I was about to see and was trying to slow me down. The moment I opened the door, the air hit me differently. Not soft. Not quiet. Disturbed. And then I saw it. At first my mind refused to process it. It was like looking at something familiar through broken glass, pieces recognizable, but the whole image wrong. The roses were gone. Not trimmed. Not pruned. Gone. Where Margaret's deep red roses once stood in careful rows, there were jagged holes in the ground, soil torn apart, roots exposed like veins ripped from the earth. The lavender bushes flattened. The stone path partially dismantled, several pieces stacked carelessly to the side like discarded scraps. And standing in the middle of it all, Clea. She held a shovel in one hand, her posture relaxed, almost casual, like she was tending to weeds instead of destroying something that had taken decades to grow. A man I didn't recognize stood nearby, loading plants, no remains into a wheelbarrow. For a second, I couldn't move. Couldn't speak. My eyes kept searching the space, desperate to find something intact, something untouched. The golden roses. I turned toward the far corner. They were still there. But not for long. The man with the wheelbarrow started heading in their direction. That's when something inside me snapped back into place. Stop. My voice came out rough, barely controlled. Neither of them moved. So I stepped forward, louder this time. Stop. The man froze. Clea turned. Slowly, and when her eyes met mine, there was no surprise in them. No guilt, no hesitation. Just mild annoyance. Like I had interrupted something trivial. "What are you doing?" I asked, though the answer was already bleeding into the ground in front of me. She sighed, resting one hand on the top of the shovel. "We talked about this," she said. No, we hadn't. I looked past her, scanning the damage again, my chest tightening. "You're destroying it," I said. It sounded smaller out loud than it felt inside me. Clea tilted her head slightly, like she was trying to understand why I wasn't keeping up. "We're renovating," she corrected. Renovating. The word didn't belong here. "This is Margaret's garden," I said. My voice rising despite my effort to keep it steady. "You don't just It was Margaret's garden, she interrupted. There it was. That subtle shift. Past tense. I felt it land somewhere deep. You had no right, I said, stepping closer now, my hands shaking, not from fear but from something heavier, something harder to control. Clea didn't step back. Instead, she met me halfway, closing the distance just enough to make her next words impossible to ignore. This isn't a graveyard anymore. She held my gaze as she said it. Didn't blink. Didn't soften it. This isn't a graveyard anymore. The words echoed in my head, louder than the tools, louder than the destruction around me. Like everything Margaret had built, everything she had been, was nothing more than something that needed to be cleared away. I felt the air leave my lungs. Not all at once. Slowly, like something inside me was collapsing inward. You don't understand, I said, but it came out quieter now, not defensive, not angry. Just hollow. Clea's expression didn't change. I understand perfectly, she replied. This space is wasted. Daniel and I want to build a patio, somewhere we can actually use, host people, live. Live? As if what existed here wasn't living already. As if it hadn't been alive for decades. Daniel, I said, the name catching in my throat as I turned toward the house. Daniel. It didn't take long. He stepped out onto the back porch a moment later, already dressed, already aware. That was the worst part. He wasn't surprised. He looked at me, then at the garden, or what was left of it, and then back at Clea. A silent exchange passed between them. Something settled. Dad, he said carefully, walking toward us, we were going to talk to you about this. When, I asked, after it was all gone. He hesitated. That hesitation told me everything. This is her home too now, he said finally, gesturing toward Clea. It's her turn to make it what she wants. Her turn. I stared at him. Really looked at him. And for the first time, I realized I didn't recognize the man standing in front of me. This was your mother, I said, my voice breaking in a way I hadn't allowed it to since the day we buried her. Daniel's jaw tightened. She's gone, Dad. There it was. Simple. Clean. Final. Gone. As if that erased everything she had left behind. As if memory was something that expired. I looked back at the garden. At the torn soil. At the broken paths. At the golden roses still standing for now. And I understood something in that moment with perfect clarity. They weren't asking. They weren't considering. They had already decided. Everything I had preserved, everything I had protected, was to them just an obstacle. Something in the way of what they wanted next. I felt very old, suddenly. Older than I had felt in years. Not because of my body, but because of the weight of what I was losing, again. Without another word, I turned away. I walked past them. Past the ruined garden. Past the man with the shovel, who now stood awkwardly still, unsure if he should continue. Back into the house. Through the kitchen. Down the narrow hallway. And into the shed out back, the one place they hadn't touched yet. I closed the door behind me. Locked it. And for the first time since Margaret died. I cried. Not loudly. Not violently. Just quietly. The kind of crying that doesn't ask for comfort. Because it already knows none is coming. But as I sat there, surrounded by the tools Margaret and I had used for years, something else began to surface beneath the grief. Something colder. Quieter. More precise. Because Clea was wrong about one thing. This wasn't a graveyard. And it wasn't abandoned. She just didn't know what still remained buried beneath it all. I stayed in that shed longer than I meant to. At first, I told myself it was just until I could breathe normally again, until my chest didn't feel like it was caving in with every inhale, until the sound of metal tearing through soil stopped echoing in my head. But even after the crying stopped, I didn't move. Because stepping back outside meant facing what was left. And I already knew what I would see. Time passed in a strange way in that small space. The light filtering through the dusty window shifted slowly, stretching shadows across the old workbench where Margaret used to sort seeds into little paper envelopes. I could still see her handwriting on some of them, neat, careful, patient. Lavender, north bed. Roses, spring trim. Golden hybrid, do not touch. I let out a hollow breath when I saw that last one. Do not touch. I wondered how many things in life came with instructions like that, and how easily people ignored them when it suited them. Outside, the sounds continued. Shovels, wood dragging. The low murmur of voices, Claire's calm and steady and Daniel's quieter, less certain. They didn't stop. Not for an hour. Not for 2. At some point, I realized something that hurt more than the destruction itself. They hadn't even come to check on me. Not once. Not after I walked away. Not after I locked myself in here. It wasn't just that they didn't understand what the garden meant to me. It was that they didn't care enough to try. That realization settled into me slowly, like dust in the air, quiet, suffocating, unavoidable. Eventually, the noise outside faded. A car door slammed. Voices moved farther away. Then silence. But it wasn't the same kind of silence I used to know. This one felt empty. Not peaceful. Just hollow. I sat there a while longer before finally standing up. My legs were stiff, my hands still slightly unsteady, but the heaviness in my chest had changed. It wasn't grief anymore. Not entirely. Grief had edges, it came in waves. This was something flatter. Colder. More settled. When I unlocked the shed door and stepped outside, the first thing I noticed was the smell. Freshly turned soil has a scent. Usually it's rich, earthy, full of life. But this smelled raw. Like something had been exposed too quickly. The garden, or what used to be the garden, was almost unrecognizable. Entire sections were cleared. The lavender bushes were gone completely now, not even remnants left behind. The rose beds had been dug out, their roots piled off to the side like discarded waste. The stone path Margaret had laid out piece by piece over years was half dismantled, its curves broken into awkward, unfinished lines. And the golden roses. I turned toward the corner where they had stood. Empty. Just a shallow trench where they used to be. For a moment, I didn't feel anything. I just stared at the spot. Waiting. As if maybe my mind hadn't caught up yet. As if they might still be there if I looked long enough. But they were. Of course they were. They took them this afternoon. I turned. Daniel stood a few feet behind me, hands in his pockets, his posture stiff. He looked tired, but not in the way I felt. His kind of tired came from inconvenience, from tension. Mine came from loss. Claire found someone who wanted them, he added. Some landscaping company. They said they could replant them somewhere else. Somewhere else? Like that made it better. Like moving them erased what had been done here. You sold them, I said. It wasn't a question. Daniel shifted slightly, uncomfortable. It wasn't about the money, he replied. They would have died if we just ripped everything out and left it. I let out a quiet breath. You already ripped everything out. He didn't answer. We stood there for a moment, the distance between us feeling much larger than the few feet of dirt and broken stone. You should have talked to me, I said finally. We tried, he said quickly. You never want to change anything. You keep everything the same, like time's supposed to just stop. Time. There it was again. Measured differently for each of us. I wasn't stopping time, I said. I was respecting it. Daniel ran a hand through his hair, frustration creeping into his expression now. Dad, it's just a yard. Just a yard. I nodded slowly. Of course that's what it was to him. Because he hadn't built it. He hadn't watched it grow. He hadn't stood beside someone he loved while they poured pieces of themselves into it, day after day, year after year. He hadn't watched it become the last place that still felt like them. "You don't get it," I said. "No," he replied a little too quickly. "I don't, and I don't think I'm supposed to. This isn't my memory, it's yours. But this house, this life, it's ours now too." Ours? Shared space. Shared decisions. Except nothing about what happened today had been shared. It had been decided. Executed. Finished. Before I even knew it was starting. I looked around one last time. At the empty beds. The broken lines. The absence of everything that used to be there. And in that moment, something inside me settled completely. Not healed. Not forgiven. Just resolved. "All right," I said quietly. Daniel blinked, caught off guard. "All right," he repeated. I nodded. "If this is how you want things," I continued, my voice steady now, "then I understand." He studied me for a second, searching for something, anger maybe, resistance. But I didn't give him any. Because anger would have made this easier for him. This calm didn't. "I'm glad you see it that way," he said cautiously. I gave a small nod. Then I turned and walked back toward the house. Not toward the shed this time. Not toward the garden. Inside. Past the kitchen. Down the hallway. Into the small office Margaret and I used to share. I closed the door behind me, but I didn't lock it. Not this time. Instead, I sat down at the desk, opened the bottom drawer, and pulled out a folder I hadn't touched in years. The paper inside was slightly yellowed, but still crisp. Still official. Still very real. I ran my fingers along the edge of the document, feeling the weight of it, not physically, but in what it represented. Ownership, control, authority, things I had never needed to assert before. Because I had never been forced to. But things had changed. Daniel thought this was about a garden. Claire thought this was about space. About modernization. About moving forward. They both believed something fundamental. Something dangerously incorrect. I leaned back in the chair, letting out a slow breath as I looked down at the document again. Because while they had been busy tearing things out of the ground, they had overlooked something far more important. Something that hadn't been touched. Hadn't been discussed. Hadn't been updated. The house, the land, everything tied to it, was still in my name. Only mine. And suddenly, for the first time that day, I felt something close to peace. Not the kind Margaret used to find on that bench in the garden. No, this was different. Sharper, more deliberate. Because grief had taken its turn. Now, it was something else's turn. Sitting there in that office, the weight of the property deed in my hands, I felt a cold clarity settle over me. The kind of clarity that only comes when the world has taken something precious and left you nothing but options you never wanted to consider. For years, I had allowed grief to anchor me to the past. The garden, Margaret's roses, the lavender, each bloom had been a tether to her memory. But in their absence, I realized how much power I still had, quietly, silently, in my own possession. Ownership, authority, legal control. The things Daniel and Claire had overlooked in their rush to assert their turn were my leverage, my advantage. And for the first time since Margaret had died, I allowed myself to imagine using it. I thought about the shed, the small, musty space where I'd hidden from the world after witnessing the destruction. It had been my refuge, yes, but now it became a symbol of the patience and observation I needed to execute what would come next. I couldn't rush. I had to be deliberate, precise. Like Margaret had been in the garden, tending to every plant with care, I had to tend to my revenge with calculated attention. I pulled out my laptop, dusted off the keys, and began mapping everything out. Property laws, homeowner obligations, zoning codes, HOA regulations, every angle became a tool. Claire thought the garden's destruction was inconsequential, a minor inconvenience to their plans for a patio. Daniel believed his wife's ambitions were harmless, that he could mediate and preserve the illusion of fairness, but both had underestimated me. Both had assumed that grief would render me passive. I started with the basics. I reviewed the deed. It clearly listed me as the sole owner, with no mention of Claire or Daniel as beneficiaries or co-owners. The garden might have been a memory for me, but legally the land was mine. Everything I had nurtured, everything they had destroyed, had been on my property. That gave me options. Options that required patience and subtlety. I spent the next week watching them. Not openly, of course, that would have been foolish, but from inside the house, through small windows that overlooked the backyard. I took note of their routines, when they were in the garden, when they left for errands, when Daniel worked late nights. I catalogued conversations I overheard. Claire talking about contractors, her impatience with useless old landscaping, Daniel's subtle rationalizations, their shared assumption that I would eventually give up any claim to control. I started planting seeds of my own, not in the soil but in their minds. Small reminders here and there. Notes about neighborhood codes, mentions of insurance requirements, offhand comments about historical preservation laws. Each one tiny, insignificant, but each one laying groundwork. Meanwhile, I rebuilt a semblance of the garden inside the shed. Not flowers, they weren't ready for that, but plans, models, sketches. I created a full mock-up of what the backyard had been, detailing every bed, every plant, every pathway. I photographed old planting schedules Margaret had kept, annotated them with precise measurements and notes about sunlight, water, and bloom cycles. I wasn't doing this for them. I wasn't creating nostalgia. I was creating evidence. Evidence I could deploy when the time came. And while I worked, I realized something important. Grief had passed, but anger had matured. It wasn't raw, irrational fury anymore. It was tempered, like steel, sharp but controlled. It whispered in my mind that justice could be exacted not through shouting or confrontation, but through patience and cunning. By the second week, I had a plan forming. It wasn't about physical confrontation or theatrics. It was about subtle leverage, exploiting the legal and procedural gaps they hadn't considered. Claire thought the garden was hers to erase. Daniel thought he could mediate and smooth things over. Both believed the narrative, that Margaret was gone, that her legacy had expired, that I had no recourse. They were wrong. I allowed myself a small, almost imperceptible smile. This was not impulsive. This was not emotional. This was strategy. And for the first time in a long time, I felt alive, not because of what I had lost, but because of what I was about to reclaim. I spent the nights refining my plan, considering contingencies. If they tried to sell plants or materials, I would have records proving ownership. If they attempted construction without proper permits, the violations would land squarely on them. If Daniel tried to argue about shared usage, the deed would make him legally powerless. But I didn't want this to feel like punishment for its own sake. It needed to be satisfying. It needed to land with that same quiet finality Margaret had always had when she corrected mistakes in the garden. Precise, inevitable, and irrevocable. And as I sat back in the shed one evening, looking at the mock-ups, the photographs, and the notes, I understood the truth. Grief had led me to passivity. Betrayal had ignited a reaction, but patience would give me the upper hand. They thought they were remodeling a yard. They thought they were asserting control. They didn't realize they were stepping into a trap that had been quietly waiting for the right moment. Because while they had dismantled the garden, I had been building something else, something even stronger. And when the moment came, they would see it. The golden roses were not lost. Margaret's legacy was not gone, and I still held the keys. I began with paperwork, not loud, not threatening, just quiet, precise steps that would slowly corner them into a position they couldn't escape. First, I confirmed my legal ownership. The deed was ironclad, my name alone, no contingencies, no shared rights. That meant any major changes on the property required my explicit approval. Anything built without that approval could be flagged as an illegal alteration, subject to fines and even reversal. A patio, new landscaping, any permanent structure, they had to come to me. Next, I started documenting everything. I photographed the garden as it had been, every plant, every stone. I dug out Margaret's original planting records and her correspondence with nurseries and landscapers. Every purchase, every delivery, every planting date, it was meticulous, but it would become a weapon. The garden wasn't just a memory, it was tangible proof of my stewardship and, more importantly, their disregard. Then I waited. Patience was critical. I didn't confront them directly. I didn't storm into the kitchen and scream about the destruction. I observed, I learned, I catalogued their routines and vulnerabilities. Daniel had an obsession with scheduling. Claire had a penchant for shortcuts, cutting corners when she could. Every flaw they revealed I noted, as if I were mapping the trajectory of a storm. The first strike was subtle. I contacted the local municipal office, pretending to be a concerned neighbor. I inquired about permit requirements for backyard construction. Claire, eager to start her patio, didn't realize that they had been moving forward without permits. Within a week, I received official documentation noting violations, construction without approval, improper landscaping alterations, potential zoning issues. I saved copies and filed them safely in my office. Next, I leveraged social proof. I spoke with neighbors I had known for decades, casually mentioning the garden's historical significance in our small community. It's been here since Margaret planted it, I would say in passing. It's really part of the neighborhood's character. Nobody minded helping. Within a few days, several neighbors had written informal statements about the garden's importance and my stewardship. Now, any attempt to claim it had no value would be difficult to justify. Meanwhile, I let Claire and Daniel believe they had freedom. I let them continue dismantling, continuing their plans. They believed the deed and ownership didn't matter, that I was a passive relic who had been broken by grief. Every step they took, every shovel I had seen in my mind, only drew them deeper into the trap. Then came the financial leverage. I reviewed the home insurance policies. Lo and behold, certain damages or changes without consent could invalidate coverage. I didn't need to threaten them with lawsuits. Simply knowing that the patio and landscaping could leave them liable for lost insurance was enough to create unease. I didn't confront them. Not yet. I didn't call, email, or knock. I let the pressure build quietly, invisibly, like water under a dam. But the final piece required timing. Claire had scheduled the delivery of her patio tiles, the moment she expected the project to be irreversible. I called the city office just before the delivery, asking for an inspection on the grounds of unpermitted construction and potential zoning violations. By the time the truck arrived, inspectors were already en route. The delivery had to halt. Workers were confused, frustrated, but ultimately compliant. Claire's carefully constructed schedule unraveled in front of her. Daniel called me later, exasperated. "Dad, why now? Why didn't you just tell us earlier?" I let him stew in the tension, calm as a winter pond. "I did tell you," I said softly, "through observation, patience, and facts. You just didn't listen until the consequences became unavoidable." The final step was psychological. Claire believed she had control. Daniel believed he could mediate. Both had ignored the law, overlooked ownership, and dismissed me as irrelevant. Now they were trapped not by force, not by anger, but by the precise, methodical application of rules they had failed to respect. I watched them squirm. I watched Claire plead, Daniel negotiate. I didn't offer mercy. Not because I was cruel, but because justice, like Margaret's garden, required care and timing. By the end of the week, the patio was on indefinite hold. Contractors refused to work until permits were properly filed. Neighbors were quietly siding with me. City inspectors had begun formal proceedings. Claire and Daniel were forced to confront their own negligence. And through it all, I remained patient, calm, observant. Because this wasn't about victory in the moment. It was about teaching a lesson in foresight, respect, and the consequences of dismissing what belongs to another. They had underestimated me. They had underestimated Margaret's legacy. And most importantly, they had underestimated patience, the quiet, lethal kind that doesn't strike until the moment is perfectly aligned. I thought I had them exactly where I wanted, cornered, frustrated, scrambling to undo the consequences of their own carelessness. I imagined Claire's fury, Daniel's guilt, the slow crumbling of their assumptions. I imagined my quiet satisfaction, a small, personal victory. But life, as it often does, had a way of twisting even the most meticulous plans. It started with a call. Early one morning, before the sunlight hit the garden, or what was left of it, the voice on the other end was calm, measured, almost apologetic. "Mr. Harris," the woman introduced herself as an official from the city's Historical Preservation Office. "We've received a report regarding your property. It appears there's a discrepancy in your deed. A third party has filed a claim asserting partial ownership of the backyard." I felt my stomach tighten. Third party, that wasn't possible. I had reviewed the deed dozens of times. There were no co-owners, no contingencies, no loopholes, at least none that I had seen. "They claim," she continued, "that certain elements of the garden, specifically the rose beds and the stone path, were considered part of a joint estate. They are requesting a full review, which could delay any actions on your property until resolved." I hung up, stunned. For a moment, the satisfaction I had built over the last month seemed to evaporate. Everything, the inspections, the halted patio, Claire's frustration, Daniel's panic, could be paused, nullified, complicated by some legal ambiguity I hadn't anticipated. I had to act fast, but this time, subtlety alone wouldn't suffice. I dug into archives, back taxes, and old estate records. I spoke with city clerks and municipal archivists, and then I found it. a notation from 30 years ago, a footnote buried in the property's legal history. Margaret had co-signed a trust with her parents for the garden plot, long before I had ever considered it hers, or ours, or even my responsibility. It was technically part of a broader estate. And someone meticulous, patient, and almost certainly opportunistic, had just discovered it, or remembered it. It hit me that this wasn't a coincidence. It was a new variable introduced into the equation, an invisible hand stirring chaos into the perfectly measured plan I had been executing. I realized that while Claire and Daniel had underestimated me, they were not the only ones who could misstep. There were players I hadn't considered, attorneys, historical preservationists, perhaps even distant family members, all capable of complicating things beyond my control. Panic didn't set in, not yet, but a cold, calculating clarity did. This twist forced me to adapt, to think 2 moves ahead rather than 1. The trap I had set for Claire and Daniel was still effective, but now it had a new dimension. The garden's fate wasn't just a matter of halted construction or legal leverage over my son and daughter-in-law. It was about asserting undeniable authority over a tangled, potentially contested legacy. I spent hours drafting new strategies. I consulted with a lawyer, an older, precise man who had handled similar property disputes for decades. Every word I spoke, every document I presented, was carefully constructed to reinforce my claim and eliminate loopholes. By the end of the week, I had not just recovered the ground I thought I had lost, I had fortified it. The legal challenge had been neutralized, and any further attempts by Claire or Daniel to override my ownership would now carry serious consequences. But the most satisfying revelation wasn't legal victory. It was understanding that the garden had become something larger than personal sentiment. It had become untouchable, enshrined by law, history, and my own vigilance. And yet, as I sat in the shed that evening, looking at the plans for reconstruction, I realized the first twist had given me something more important than leverage or legal power. It had awakened me to the fact that revenge, no matter how meticulous, is never a straight line. There are always variables, always unforeseen obstacles. The brilliance of a plan is in adapting to them, and in ensuring that when the final moment comes, it lands harder than anyone could imagine. Claire thought she was frustrated before. Daniel thought he was clever. Neither had any idea what was coming. But now, with this twist in play, I had a weapon far sharper than permits or neighbors' testimonies. I had certainty, adaptability, and patience honed to a razor's edge. And I smiled, quietly, calmly, as Margaret would have wanted. Because the storm wasn't over. It was just beginning. By the time the weekend arrived, Claire and Daniel were unraveling in ways I hadn't fully anticipated. The inspectors hadn't returned yet, but the notices and legal letters had done their work. Claire was tense, jittery, packing the living room as though she could will the problem away. Daniel hovered nearby, trying to mediate, trying to soothe, but every word he spoke seemed to dig the hole deeper. I watched from the office window, a cup of coffee in hand, and let it happen. Patience, as always, was my ally. They thought they could bully the situation, ignore the rules, and intimidate me with time. But the first twist had shown me that patience wasn't just about waiting, it was about observing, adapting, and executing at the precise moment, and that moment was now. I walked out into the backyard, slow, deliberate, letting each step sound a note of authority. Claire glanced up from the patio plans spread across the table she had been consulting, eyes narrowing. Daniel's head snapped toward me, a mixture of irritation and fear crossing his face. "Dad," Daniel said, trying to keep his voice steady, We've been trying to make this easier for everyone. You can't." "I can," I said, my voice calm, even, legally, logically, and morally. Claire scoffed, but her hand trembled slightly as she gripped a tile. "You've gone through the trouble of thinking every detail, haven't you?" she said, trying to mask frustration with sarcasm. "But this isn't about who's right on paper, it's about living here, enjoying life." I took another step forward, and this time Daniel flinched. The gravity of the situation was finally beginning to hit them. "Life?" I asked softly. "Do you know what Margaret considered life?" I gestured to the broken beds, the absent roses. "These plants took decades to grow, decades of care, patience, attention. You came in and destroyed it in weeks, and you call that life?" Claire's lip curled. "It was just a garden." "Just a garden," I repeated, letting the words hang like smoke in the air. That garden was the last thing that connected me to her, the last thing that held her memory tangible in this world. And you, I paused, letting the pause stretch, you desecrated it. Daniel opened his mouth to speak but stopped. He realized I wasn't shouting, I wasn't pleading, I was stating facts, calm facts, facts that had teeth. "I have already involved the city, the inspectors, neighbors, documents," I continued. Everything you've done without my consent is recorded. Every shovel, every uprooted plant, every stone moved illegally is evidence against you. You thought this was your home now, but legally this has always been mine." The realization hit them slowly, painfully. Claire's face went pale, the defiance fading like mist under the morning sun. Daniel's eyes flicked between me and the garden, tracing the ruined beds, and then back to me. "And any further work, any construction, any landscaping, any attempt to claim control, will require my approval first. And I assure you, after what's happened, that approval will not be forthcoming." Claire opened her mouth, but no words came. Daniel's shoulders slumped. Their confidence, their assumption that I would simply fade into the background of grief, shattered. I watched as panic settled over them, not the frantic, chaotic panic of the moment they realized something was wrong, but the slow, creeping dread of inevitability. They understood now. They were trapped. This was the turning point. From the destruction of the garden, from their belief that they could simply overwrite history, the tables had turned completely. I wasn't angry. I wasn't vengeful in the emotional sense. I was executing a plan with precision, and at this point, that plan wasn't just about halting construction, it was about establishing control. The beauty of it wasn't in confrontation, it was in inevitability. Claire had believed she could dominate the narrative. Daniel had believed he could mediate and remain safe. Neither had understood that control wasn't given, it was maintained, quietly, patiently, relentlessly. And I maintained it. I stepped closer to the corner where the golden roses had once stood, now empty. I didn't touch the soil. I didn't gesture. I just let them see it. Let them understand that their actions, impulsive and entitled, had been met not with rage, but with consequence. "You assumed I was powerless," I said softly. "You assumed that grief had weakened me. You assumed that the past didn't matter anymore. And now you see that assumption was the mistake." Daniel swallowed hard. Claire's eyes darted around, searching for an escape, for some way to undo the irreversible. There was none. Because I wasn't angry, I was resolved, and resolution, like a carefully planned garden, doesn't bend to panic. They were trapped, and they had no one to blame but themselves. Just when I thought the trap had snapped shut, reality delivered a complication I hadn't foreseen. I was reviewing Margaret's old photographs of the garden, meticulously cataloguing every plant, every stone path, every bed, when I noticed something I hadn't before. A faint mark on one of the photographs, almost imperceptible, a corner folded in such a way that it revealed writing on the back. Curious, I picked it up and unfolded it carefully. My eyes widened as I read the faint, looping handwriting. "If anything happens to me and this garden is threatened, remember that it's not just soil and stone. It is a record of life, love, and trust. Whoever claims it without care must answer for it." The handwriting was Margaret's, clear, precise, unmistakable, but that wasn't the twist. The twist was the stamp at the bottom, Legal Testament Clause 12b, filed in the county archives. I hadn't known this existed. Margaret had anticipated future threats, not from grief, not from time, but from people who would come with entitlement in their eyes. She had prepared for this eventuality decades before. Immediately, I called the county archives. Within hours, I had the document in my hands. Clause 12b granted me not just ownership of the property, but authority over its upkeep and legacy. Anyone altering or removing elements of the garden without my explicit approval would be legally accountable, not just to me, but to the county's Historical Preservation Office. This changed everything. Claire and Daniel were no longer just frustrated or trapped by my maneuvering. They had unwittingly committed actions that could be interpreted as legal violations, even as potential vandalism. But Margaret's clause went further. It explicitly allowed me to reclaim plants, paths, and landscaping features that had been removed or damaged. I could require that anything taken be returned, or replaced at the offender's expense. The clause even referenced the intent of the original cultivator, tying every plant and stone to Margaret's vision. The scale of this revelation hit me like a wave. Everything I had planned, the inspections, the legal leverage, the neighbor statements, was now reinforced by an unassailable legal backbone. Claire and Daniel had no defense. Their assumptions, their arrogance, their casual disregard for the garden, they were now not just morally wrong, but legally vulnerable. I felt a quiet thrill. It wasn't just satisfaction, it was awe. Margaret had left me a weapon disguised as foresight, decades in the making. While I had been patient, while I had executed my plan with precision, she had orchestrated a safeguard that made the plan unstoppable. And then the final piece fell into place. I reviewed the notes from the landscapers Claire had hired. Several had delivered plants and stones to storage yards, unaware of the deed or the clause. With the new claws in hand, I could demand their return. Not only that, I could ensure that the restoration of the garden followed Margaret's exact specifications, meticulous measurements, planting schedules, and placement. Claire's patio dreams halted indefinitely. Daniel's mediating gestures rendered irrelevant. Their ignorance of Margaret's foresight had turned their own actions against them. I leaned back in my chair, the realization settling like sunlight on cold stone. They had thought they were clever. They had thought they could overwrite history, erase a legacy, and reshape my home to their desires. But in reality, they had merely revealed how predictable they were. Their impatience, their arrogance, their disregard for care and memory, they had become instruments of their own undoing. And Margaret had foreseen it all. She had built more than a garden. She had built a safeguard that outlived her, a mechanism of poetic justice that I could now wield with both precision and inevitability. The garden was no longer just a garden. It was a fortress, a record, a testament. And when the final moment arrived, Claire and Daniel would see it not just as consequence, but as inevitability. Because Margaret had planned for this, and I was about to finish it. The day came quietly, almost innocuously. Claire and Daniel had gone out for errands, thinking they had at least a few uninterrupted hours to continue their plans. I stayed inside, reviewing Margaret's Clause 12b one last time. Every line, every stipulation, every legal footnote was memorized. I didn't need to rush, perfection required patience. When I stepped outside, the air smelled faintly of damp earth and fresh beginnings. The garden wasn't fully restored yet, that would come later. For now, it was enough that I had the leverage, the law, and the moral certainty of Margaret's foresight. I made a few calls, one to the county historical office, another to the landscapers who had removed the golden roses and stone paths. The message was simple. All materials and plants removed from the property must be returned immediately for restoration under Clause 12b. Failure to comply could result in fines and legal action. By the time Claire and Daniel returned, their plan was unraveling before their eyes. Trucks arrived to deliver the roses and stones back to their original locations. Inspectors arrived to evaluate the work that had been done illegally. Neighbors who had previously been quiet allies of mine were now present, offering statements about the garden's significance and the necessity of preserving it exactly as Margaret had intended. Claire froze when she saw the trucks and inspectors. Daniel's eyes went wide, and he finally looked at me not as his father, but as someone wielding control they hadn't anticipated. "Dad, what's happening?" Daniel asked, voice tight. I smiled softly, calm but unyielding. "What should have happened before you started tearing things apart?" Claire sputtered, "You can't do this. This is our home now too." I shook my head. "You've learned the hard way that property ownership and legacy are not optional. They cannot be rewritten by impulse or desire." One by one, the gardeners returned the plants, the stones, the careful arrangements. The golden roses were replanted precisely where they had been, the soil adjusted to the exact measurements Margaret had left, every bed restored, every path aligned. The garden slowly reclaimed its original form, and with it, the life and memory Margaret had left behind. Claire's fury was visible, raw. She tried to argue, to interrupt, to negotiate, but the inspectors politely but firmly reminded her that all actions were under legal observation, and any interference could result in fines or criminal charges. Daniel tried reasoning, pleading even, but I didn't speak. My silence, deliberate and patient, spoke louder than words. The garden had become a living testament, a symbol of the careful, inevitable justice Margaret had designed, and I was its executor. By late afternoon, the garden was not only restored, it was untouchable. Claire and Daniel stood on the porch, defeated, realizing that the tables had completely turned. What had begun as a simple dispute over a patio had escalated into a legal and moral reckoning. For years, I had been the one grieving, the one powerless. But now, every step they had taken to assert control, every moment of disregard for Margaret's legacy, had only deepened their own accountability. I finally spoke, quietly, calmly, but with authority. Margaret entrusted this garden to me. She left instructions, records, and protections to ensure that it would survive, and that anyone who attempted to erase it would face consequences. You were given a choice to respect it. You did not. Now you must live with the consequences of your actions. Neither of them said anything. Neither of them moved. They were caught in the web of their own misjudgment, completely and utterly exposed. I didn't gloat, I didn't shout. I simply walked through the restored beds, touched the soil gently where Margaret's hands had once pressed it, and allowed the calm inevitability of justice to settle in the air. The garden had survived, Margaret's legacy had survived, and for the first time since she passed, I felt a profound sense of closure. They had underestimated patience, underestimated foresight, underestimated me. And in that underestimation, they had sealed their own fate. I stepped back onto the porch as the sun dipped low, casting long, golden shadows across the restored garden. The roses glowed in Margaret's favorite shades, deep crimson, fiery gold, and soft apricot, aligned exactly as she had arranged them decades ago. Every stone, every lavender bush, every bed reflected the care and precision she had poured into this space. Claire and Daniel stood silently, watching the transformation they had tried to destroy, realizing for the first time that they hadn't been clever or bold, they had been reckless. Every assumption, every shortcut, every bit of entitlement had led them here, and there was nothing left for them to do but watch. I didn't gloat, I didn't rub their noses in it. Satisfaction didn't need spectacle. It was quieter than that. It was in the lore, in the legacy, in the meticulous restoration that proved patience and foresight were more powerful than arrogance. I ran my hand along the edge of the path, feeling the familiar grooves Margaret had carved, the subtle slopes that guided water, the perfect alignment of stones. I breathed deeply, inhaling the scent of earth, of lavender, of roses. And in that moment, the past and the present were whole again. Margaret's touch, her memory, her meticulous planning, it all lived on. Not in anger, not in loss, not in fleeting frustration, but in enduring truth. I turned toward Claire and Daniel one last time, calm and deliberate, and let them see the inevitability in my gaze. No words were needed. The lesson had been delivered, the justice enacted, the tables turned. And then I walked away, leaving them to the quiet weight of their own choices, knowing that Margaret and I had already won. Because some things are untouchable. Some things endure. Some things belong to the dead, the patient, and the wise. And as the last light settled over the garden, I whispered to the wind, just enough for myself to hear. You thought this was hers to erase, but it was always mine to protect. The garden stood unbroken. And so did I.